Welcome to a deep dive. We take source materials and, well, we unpack the crucial insights for you.
And today, we are really diving deep, straight into the chaos of the 2008 financial crisis response.
Specifically, the huge Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP.
That's the one. And we're drawing heavily from one key source here, an insider's account, the guy who was actually appointed Special Inspector General SIGTARP, the watchdog, for that massive, $700 billion government bailout.
Yeah, a huge amount. So our mission today, understand the, frankly, incredible challenges this watchdog faced.
And the dynamics, right, between the government, the oversight bodies, Wall Street, often surprising, sometimes pretty frustrating dynamics, according to this account.
Absolutely. And we want to look at the lasting questions this whole period raised about financial stability, accountability, basically trying to hold power accountable when, well, trillions are flying around.
Okay, so let's start with the person at the center of this account. The source introduces Neil Barofsky. Now, he wasn't your typical Washington insider, not at all.
Right, he was a federal prosecutor from New York, used to dealing with really complex, high-stakes stuff.
Yeah, like big drug cartels, FARC, for example. Which, interestingly, the source notes taught him about turf wars and politics inside big organizations, even government ones like the DEA. And, of course, white-collar crime.
Not exactly the resume you'd expect for overseeing a bank bailout, is it?
Not really. And his experience prosecuting those cases, it really shaped how he saw things. Take the Refco Securities fraud case, a massive financial mess. That showed him the hidden dangers in mortgage-backed securities, even the ones Wall Street gave, top ratings.
Plus, he'd been working directly on mortgage fraud investigations, so he saw firsthand the predatory lending, the foreclosure scams.
And Wall Street's role, right, pushing lenders to lower standards just to churn out more mortgages, more fees.
It sounds like he saw how the system incentivized bad behavior. The source mentions the worse the mortgage for the borrower, often the more profitable for everyone else involved, short-term anyway.
He also talks about being deeply affected by 9/11 and mentors who taught him this principle. Always the right thing, rarely the easy thing.
So a strong ethical compass combined with a prosecutor's focus on results, on investigations.
Yeah, not exactly the go along to get along type you might expect in D.C. bureaucracy.
So you can imagine when he gets this out-of-the-blue call offering him the SIGTARP job, overseeing TARP.
He was reluctant. I mean, he was right in the middle of a huge trial, the Refco case with Joseph Collins.
And launching a new mortgage fraud group he was really invested in.
He apparently found those mortgage fraud cases just appalling. Seeing how predatory practices hit struggling homeowners, he wanted justice there.
But people pushed him to take the SIGTARP role.
Big time. People he respected basically told him it was a national necessity. Duty calls.
And he immediately got a sense of Washington politics.
Oh, yeah, right away. Learned he needed support from, both sides of the aisle to even get confirmed.
That sounds tricky.
He mentions colleagues like Bill Burke, a Republican with D.C. connections, and Preet Bharara, a well-known Democrat, working behind the scenes, vouching for him, highlighting his bipartisan background.
Even the media got involved.
Picked up on his background. There were even some colorful quotes from his dad about him being tough because he had older sisters.
Yeah.
Human interest stuff.
So clearly not just about spreadsheets from the get-go, it was political.
Absolutely. His confirmation was weird, too. Needed 2 hearings because Senate committees were, fighting over jurisdiction. Turf wars again.
Okay, so he takes the job. He arrives in Washington. What's the reality of starting SIGTARP?
Pretty grim, actually, according to his account. Despite this massive mission, the office physically started underground. In a basement.
Literally underground.
Literally. Lacking basic resources. It was a sign, really, that building this thing from scratch was going to be an uphill battle.
And he gets introduced to the existing Inspector General community, the IGs. What's that world like?
He learns there are sort of archetypes. You've got the lapdog IG, too close to the agency they watch.
Okay.
The standard watchdog focuses mostly on audits, process checks. And then the junkyard dog, the aggressive one, willing to really challenge the agency.
And what was the general advice he received from that community?
Caution, mostly.
Yeah.
Emphasize audits, not investigations. Focus on process. Don't dare question Treasury's policy decisions. Avoid Congress. Keep a low profile. Aim for balance. Don't rock the boat.
So the key takeaway here is, how did that advice sit with him? Given his background and the huge task.
It just didn't fit. I mean, the traditional IG approach seemed totally wrong for overseeing hundreds of billions already flying out the door with little scrutiny.
You need investigations for that, not just audits.
Exactly. And with potential systemic problems, he felt he had to question policy, not just check boxes. He realized pretty quickly, according to the source, that the junkyard dog approach was the only way he could actually do the job he was hired for.
Did he run into resistance right away from within the government itself?
Oh, absolutely. Immediate friction with the existing Treasury IG, Eric Thorson.
How so?
Well, Barofsky was concerned. Thorson hadn't really done much TARP oversight before SIGTARP existed, and then seemed less than cooperative once Barofsky arrived, only starting a big TARP audit after Barofsky was confirmed.
Suspicious timing.
And there was this odd incident early on. OMB granted SIGTARP a waiver needed for an audit, then revoked it literally minutes later. Barofsky suspected Treasury interference right from the start, trying to block their work.
Wow. So facing that culture, that resistance, how did he decide to run SIGTARP?
He took outside advice seriously. Bill Burke reportedly told him, Congress wants results, act like you did with the Refco guys, the ones rotting in jail.
Tough advice.
So Barofsky made a clear decision. Reject the traditional IG mold. SIGTARP would operate like prosecutors.
Meaning?
Prioritize investigations. Speak truth to power forcefully, transparently, through public reports, focus only on the mission, not the political heat.
And that really set the stage for the core conflict, didn't it? SIGTARP pushing for accountability and transparency.
Versus Treasury, which the source portrays as often resistant, lacking transparency, and having, well, different priorities.
A key early clash was over the Capital Purchase Program, the CPP.
Yes, this was a big shift. TARP was originally legislated, remember, to buy troubled assets from banks, but Treasury quickly changed course.
Right. They started injecting capital directly into banks, buying preferred stock through the CPP.
And Treasury's public reason was
to stimulate lending, get credit flowing again.
But the source suggests the immediate, perhaps more critical reason was just pure survival, preventing major bank collapses.
Like who?
Paulson apparently told Barofsky he thought Morgan Stanley was just days away from failing, and Ben Bernanke reportedly said Goldman Sachs would be next. So, pretty dire.
So, stated goal. Lending, real immediate goal,
right.
Stop the bleeding. How did Congress react to this pivot? And the fact that banks weren't necessarily lending?
Frustration, reportedly. Especially when news reports quoted bank CEOs saying, basically, thanks for the cash, but we're not changing our lending.
You're kidding.
Nope. John Hope III from Whitney National Bank was quoted saying they weren't changing their model. Others apparently saw it as just a windfall, no strings attached.
So naturally, SIGTARP wants to know, hey, are these banks actually using this taxpayer money to lend?
Makes sense, right? But when SIGTARP decided to audit this, Treasury strongly opposed it.
On what grounds?
Their main argument was fungibility. Money is fungible. You can't track specific dollars once they go into a big pot. So they argued an audit would be useless, or the banks could easily game it.
Okay, so the crucial point here is this fungibility debate. It wasn't just technical accounting jargon.
Not at all. It became this huge battleground, not just over accounting, but over basic transparency. Could the watchdog actually verify how hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars were being used? That was the real question.
But SIGTARP didn't back down. How did they manage to push the audit forward against Treasury's resistance?
This is where politics came in. They got crucial support from Congress. Senator Grassley, in particular, publicly questioned why OMB was trying to block the audit waiver SIGTARP needed.
Ah, public pressure.
Exactly. That political heat helped SIGTARP get the waiver reinstated. It really shows how achieving even basic oversight required a political fight.
So what did the audit find? Did it prove Treasury right about fungibility making tracking impossible?
Well, no, not entirely. Treasury's claim wasn't fully accurate. It was challenging, sure, but many banks did provide information.
Like what?
Some used the funds to repay credit lines. Others used it for acquisitions like PNC buying City National Bank.
Yeah.
And here's the key part. Some large banks actually reported they did segregate or track the TARP funds.
Directly contradicting Treasury's argument that it couldn't be done.
Precisely.
Okay, so this whole CPP battle, it seems to highlight a broader theme in the source, the significant influence of Wall Street itself on these bailout programs.
Yeah, that's a major concern expressed in the account, that many TARP programs were heavily shaped, maybe even designed, by the very financial firms that stood to gain the most from them.
Can you give us an example?
The Public-Private Investment Program, PPIP, is a big one. This was meant to buy those toxic assets off bank books.
Okay.
But according to the source, big investment firms like BlackRock, TCW, PEMCO were involved in actually designing the program.
Wait, the firms that would later manage the funds and profit were involved in setting it up.
That's the picture painted. And SIGTARP apparently identified huge fraud risks in PPIP, collusion between buyers and sellers, maybe even buyers colluding with each other. Money laundering risks, too.
And it wasn't just these big Wall Street programs, right? Issues cropped up with programs supposedly aimed at helping ordinary people, too.
Right. Take the Home Affordable Modification Program, HAP, meant to help struggling homeowners modify their mortgages.
Did it work?
Not really, according to this account. It ultimately failed to provide widespread relief. The source mentions things like no-doc trial modifications, basically, a return to some lax practices, and a general sense that Treasury just wasn't effective in helping homeowners, despite the program's name.
And speaking of public reaction,
Go ahead.
you can't discuss TARP without mentioning the AIG bonuses. That caused uproar.
Oh, massive uproar. AIG got staggering amounts of taxpayer money, $170 billion total support, with $40 billion from TARP itself. And yet they planned to pay out $168 million in bonuses.
Including to people in the very unit that basically cratered the company.
Exactly. The public was understandably furious.
How did the government, specifically the New York Fed under Tim Geithner then, handle that AIG bailout and the bonus situation?
The NY Fed was central to the AIG rescue, negotiating with the banks AIG owed money to, like Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank.
And the source highlights issues there.
Yeah, like the decision to pay those counterparty banks 100 cents on the dollar for assets that were worth much less. The argument was to prevent a wider collapse, immense pressure, but still controversial.
And the bonuses?
The handling of the bonuses was also heavily criticized. Geithner reportedly admitted later their negotiation strategy had little chance of getting bonus money back, but didn't fully explain why they didn't push harder. It was a mess.
So when SIGTARP started issuing critical reports on things like AIG, they faced pushback.
Serious pushback. The source describes Treasury sometimes seeming to, well, obscure information.
Like how?
There's an example of an accounting change that made AIG's projected losses look $40 billion smaller on paper, but without any actual improvement in AIG's underlying business. SIGTARP pointed this out.
And the reaction?
Intense attacks from Treasury and the White House when SIGTARP issued critical reports.
What kind of attack?
Attempts to pressure reporters not to cover critical stories, publishing really harsh editorials that suspiciously mirrored White House talking points, like one called Treasury's backseat driver, basically painting SIGTARP as Monday morning quarterbacks.
So how did SIGTARP deal with that? How did they maintain credibility?
Transparency was their shield, basically. By releasing detailed findings, actual documents in their public reports, they built trust with the press.
So reporters learned SIGTARP's reports were credible, even if the administration didn't like them.
Exactly. That transparency became crucial protection against the political attacks.
Okay, moving beyond the banks, TARP money also went to bail out the auto industry. GM, Chrysler. What did SIGTARP find there?
It audited one specific part, the incredibly rapid closure of thousands of auto dealerships during the restructuring.
And their findings were critical.
Very critical of how Treasury handled it.
What specifically?
They found Treasury's auto team relied heavily, maybe too heavily, on advice from Wall Street analysts, people with zero real expertise in the auto industry.
Seriously? Wall Street analysts for auto dealership decisions.
That's what the source says. And apparently, they largely ignored advice from non-Wall Street sources who warned against cutting so many dealerships so quickly.
And the impact.
The source notes Treasury gave basically no thought to the massive job losses these sudden closures would cause in communities across the country.
How was that report received? More pushback?
Oh, yeah. That Treasury's backseat driver editorial again, attacking the report, accusing SIGTARP of unfair hindsight.
But isn't using hindsight part of an inspector general's job? To learn lessons?
That's the crucial takeaway. The criticism missed the point. And IG's role is to analyze decisions, using hindsight if needed, to find flaws and suggest improvements, not just to rubber stamp what happened.
There was another transparency issue with GM too, wasn't there, about repaying a loan?
Yes. GM repaid a TARP loan, and Treasury hailed it as proof GM was healthy again. A success story. But, according to the source, SIGTARP found GM actually used funds from other government sources, money also provided or enabled by TARP, or the broader intervention to make that repayment.
So basically moving government money from one pocket to another and calling it success.
That's the implication.
Yeah.
SIGTARP released documents showing where the money really came from, contradicting Treasury's narrative. The source argues this damaged the government's credibility about the bailout success.
It's worth remembering, too, that TARP's $700 billion, while huge, was only part of the picture, right? The total government intervention was much bigger.
Absolutely. The source makes that point clearly. TARP was just one element. There were trillions more in government guarantees, liquidity support, for money market funds, commercial paper. It was a massive system-wide effort to prevent total meltdown.
Okay, so let's fast forward. After the immediate crisis, Congress passes the Dodd-Frank Act, supposedly to reform the financial system, prevent another crisis. How did the source view Dodd-Frank and the overall aftermath?
The argument presented is, well, pretty stark. It suggests that while the bailouts stopped the immediate freefall, they might have actually preserved, even worsened, the too-big-to-fail problem.
How so? Made it worse.
The view is that the biggest banks ended up even bigger, more concentrated after the crisis than before. The rescue solidified their dominance.
And Dodd-Frank, did the source think it fixed too big to fail?
The perspective offered is, no. That despite its intentions, Dodd-Frank didn't effectively end too big to fail. It might have even unintentionally cemented it in place.
What's the evidence cited for that view?
Things like, banks are just plain bigger now than pre-crisis. They hold a larger share of the nation's assets, and they reportedly still benefit from a too-big-to-fail funding advantage.
Meaning the market still thinks the government would bail them out if they got into trouble.
Exactly, which lets them borrow money more cheaply than smaller banks that don't have that implicit guarantee.
Right.
It tilts the playing field.
And the implementation of Dodd-Frank itself. Any issues there?
The source points to challenges. Delays, for example, in setting the higher capital requirements for the biggest banks, the cushion they need to absorb losses.
And concerns about how the banks themselves are responding to the new rules.
Definitely. A big concern raised is that banks are actively lobbying against rules, finding loopholes, basically gaming the system.
Like the Volcker rule. That was meant to stop banks from making risky bets with their own money, right?
Right. Proprietary trading. But the source highlights loopholes. Banks allegedly relabeling speculative trading as okay hedging.
Is there an example?
The source points to the JP Morgan Chase London whale incident, where the bank lost billions on trades they initially tried to classify as hedges. It illustrates how these rules can potentially be skirted or interpreted loosely.
So the fear is what? If banks can game the rules and implementation is slow.
The fear expressed is that regulators, maybe even Treasury, might become too accommodating, too influenced by the industry they're supposed to regulate. Regulatory capture, basically.
Leading to
Potentially weakening the reforms over time. Sliding back towards the pre-crisis situation, undercapitalized big banks, taking on too much risk, knowing they might be bailed out again.
Yeah.
Increasing the systemic danger. And the source also touches briefly on other limitations, Hanjappi failing homeowners, as we mentioned, and the fact that while some individuals faced criminal charges, like Lee Farkas,
Right.
the criminal justice system just wasn't really equipped to tackle the huge systemic problems that caused the crisis in the first place.
Wow. So reflecting on this deep dive, it really underscores the incredible difficulty of being that watchdog, SIGTARP, in the middle of such a massive storm.
Absolutely. Facing intense political pressure, constantly battling just to get basic information and transparency, pushing back against incredibly powerful interests.
Including often resistance from within the government agencies themselves.
Yeah, that core tension just runs throughout the account, doesn't it? The stated goals of this huge bailout program versus the messy, complex reality of how it was implemented, shaped by politics, by industry influence.
It seems like overseeing Wall Street was only half the battle. A huge part was overseeing Washington, fighting the internal culture to demand accountability.
And that really leaves us with a crucial question, maybe the crucial question for you, the listener, looking at the financial system today.
Given everything we've unpacked, the struggles for transparency detailed in this account, the concerns about regulatory capture, the enduring power of these too-big-to-fail institutions.
Are those underlying vulnerabilities, the ones that led to the 2008 crisis, still lurking in our system? What have we really, truly learned? Something to think about.